and adequate, and that there can never be an effect inconsistent with its cause, or a cause that does not produce a consistent effect. This takes what we like to call luck, chance, providence, accident, out of our consciousness as factors in existence. And it is very good for us that we should lose these concepts. For as long as man believes that he lives in an unlawful universe, or a universe of accidents, he can never develop an adequate moral philosophy. He can never recognize personal responsibility unless he realizes that his action must have reaction. He can never fully integrate himself into the concept of a vast integrated sphere unless he recognizes his own existence both as an effect and a cause. That he is here as a species, as a collective, because he is the next step in something. Because in his turn, from himself will come the next step in something. And each stage or development of things has its inevitable, unchangeable patterns. And also that once causes have been set in motion, they cannot be frustrated. They must move toward their inevitable consequences. And man, nature, or space, unfolding according to the laws of cause and effect, can never invalidate any of the procedures which have already been set in motion. Consequently, we have a new code of adjustment necessary, namely that all life must learn to cheerfully abide by the consequences of the causations which it has set in motion. The deity itself must abide by the effect created by its own primary creative impulse. Once creation begins, once the great primal cause, the fiat, is spoken or sounded, once the Logos brings forth the worlds, from that time on, the Logos, the gods, and the powers are subjected to their own laws. Deity is not a being outside of law, but is the power of law itself, and must forever abide by the principles which it has established. Man must therefore learn that the lawmaker must keep his own laws, and that no individual can escape from the lawful consequences of things done or things undone. The law of cause and effect has also some rather benevolent promises about it. It tells us that no thing in itself good can be without consequence. That the universe, by its own nature, is good. Being the product of the divine will, it is divine. Therefore, the ultimate effect of the creation as it unfolds must be good, because its cause is good. Therefore, evil can never vanquish good, because it can never overwhelm the great, eternal, and good cause which set all things in motion, and must bring a harvest according to its own nature. Now, man, in his own limited way, has always attempted to resist the great laws of cause and effect. He has attempted to reap where he has not sown. He has attempted to escape from the consequences of his own actions and conduct. But while he believes he can do this, he is under a delusion. And because of this delusion, we've had dictators and autocrats and despotisms. We have had innumerable afflictions of mankind by man, simply because we do not believe the justice of universal procedure. Yet one by one the tyrants have fallen. One by one the despots have gone their way. One by one the pomp and circumstances vanish from our sight. only the law remains, and only the simple, natural obedience gives the security that man requires. Now, the law of cause and effect also tells us that from first cause, all causation must have in its nature necessity. Therefore, the law of cause and effect is related to the principle of necessity. And the great sphere of cause and effect is called the sphere of necessity. All things grow. Growth is necessary. All things grow slowly, often painfully, because of inability to fully understand. But man grows victoriously because he gradually learns to understand causes. He learns little by little to protect himself against forces and circumstances which might be destructive to him. He learns how to estimate the results of things. He learns thrift and providence in this way. He learns the importance of good temper and a good disposition. He learns ultimately that if he is friendly, he will have friends. If he is unfriendly, he will be friendless. These things he learns. He learns sometimes the hard way. Often he resists and rebels, but ultimately the grand pattern of law must become apparent to him. And he must realize that he is moving again within an immutable structure, a structure so great and so universal and so ultimately perfect that there can be no resistance to it that is successful. Now, the law of cause and effect operates again to another law, which emerges out of its own nature and becomes important to us. Got a little list of them here because I want to get all 7 in before the time is up. Once in a while, you know, we skimp a little on the last one of something, and that we don't want to do tonight. Now, the law of cause and effect indicates or suggests a kind of balancing, so that we come out of the law of cause and effect with the next law, which is the law of polarity, which leads ultimately to the establishment of the principle of equilibrium. Now, everything in nature, like the celestial crab which crawls forward with a strange and angular motion, everything in nature moves according to and functions by the principle of polarity. In a way, cause and effect is polarity. Cause being a positive pole, effect being a negative pole. Here we have electricity and magnetism. We have dynamic and static everywhere. We have the poles of a battery. Everywhere in life, we find the problem of polarity operating. And polarity becomes important to us in many, many respects, because man, through the gradual understanding of the law of polarity, has a gradual tendency to correct his own tendency to be lopsided, which becomes a very serious thing. Now, of course, when we look in the mirror, it may not be noticeable, but at the same time, in our conduct, it usually is. Polarity means that most forms of life oscillate or move between two poles, alternating between positive and negative. Creation, for example, moves between two vast poles, manifestation and obscuration, or the day and night of the gods. Every period of manifestation must be followed by a period of repose. There is a great respiration, the breath of Shiva, the outbreathing of worlds in the great dawn of things, the inbreathing of worlds at the end of things. There is the ebbing and the flowing of the tide, waking and sleeping, life and death, winter and summer. Everywhere in nature we have these polarities, which as the seasons do in the earth. These result in the gradual ripening of things from their seed to their harvest. And without these alternations, without these constant alterations of polarities, the magnificent framework of law could not accomplish its perfect work. Now, in this great pattern of polarization, as we care to call it, we see innumerable things of value to ourselves here and now. One of the most common polarizations we recognize is the polarization of generation. We know also the famous reference made by Plato in his study of the great Platonic year, in which he describes that the great 25,000-year cycle resulting from the precession of the equinoxes is divided into two periods, or halves, one of which was a period of fertility and the other of sterility. In periods of fertility, great cultures flourish. Wisdom comes forth. Art and beauty are manifested. In periods of sterility, men lose a certain amount of internal vitality. Materialism dominates. Men cease to have their ideals. The earth is impoverished and no longer produces as good grain and food. And cultures have a tendency to languish for lack of both spiritual and material nutrition. Here is again action and repose. So as we have in cause and effect action and reaction, here on the laws of polarity we have action and repose. Things moving always by certain effort, accompanied again by certain periods of rest. And we also find that in nature everything is generated through polarization. And at the same time, there is a constant motion of life away from these polarized opposites toward the mysterious point of equilibrium. Now, we have considerable philosophical discussion relating to this issue, and it becomes more involved than we perhaps realize. Equilibrium is, to the average individual's concept, an idea of the suspension of motion. Today, for example, we are proud of the fact that we are very highly polarized. We say that an individual is very enthusiastic at one moment and utterly down in the dumps the next, is really living life to its fullest. He's having his good days and his bad days, but he's certainly having a lot of excitement. Whereas if we find an individual who is by nature rather quiet and composed, we suspected him of being dead while still he is alive. If he doesn't get angry, we think he is timid. If he isn't jealous of somebody, he doesn't care for anyone. And so we make gradually a great deal out of this polarized extremism of our conduct. We had a lady in not long ago who was quite convinced her husband didn't love her, because for 5 years he had shown no sign of jealousy. It was just something she could hardly endure. She had no complaint, she had no reason to think he didn't, but he just wasn't jealous. That was a bad sign all by itself. So we have people who honestly believe that unless we are really quite tempestuous in our attitudes, that we haven't any. Or if we don't take violent sides in arguments and debates, we're not patriotic. If we're not for our candidate and against all the others, we have no political vision. And of course, occasionally we come to a sort of negative equilibrium in which they decide none of the candidates is any good. This, of course, is also considered bad because that is defeatism. It sounds as though we are trying to escape a nasty decision, and we are. But we have come to think of excess as being an indication of life, moderation as an indication of death. And our psychologists are feeding us some of that thinking these days. And furthermore, they are reminding us that one of the most common symptoms of paranoia is great periods of exhilaration followed by great periods of depression. So we have our choice. If we have exhilaration and depression, we are admired by our friends and accused of being paranoiac by our psychologists. Actually, nature is moving toward equilibrium. But equilibrium is not something that is going to sneak up on us unaware. Equilibrium does not mean that someday, whether we will or not, the pendulum is going to stop in the middle. Equilibrium is the most difficult thing in nature to attain, because equilibrium is immortality. Equilibrium is a deathless state. It is a state in which excess ceases. All immoderations come to an end. And in the complete suspension of polarization, we attain what the Buddhist terms nirvana. For nirvana is the end of the imbalance of conflict in the compound personality of the human being. In the universe, equilibrium is also the end of conflict. But conflict cannot end until the conflicting factors have been resolved. And these conflicting factors are nothing more or less than the unfinishedness in things. Everything that is imperfect is unbalanced. And consequently, only perfection, which is a total equilibrium in the term of plus, can have complete equilibrium. Absolute negative equilibrium, or an equilibrium in the minus, is total negation. And total negation we cannot find either, although we find phases of negation which may nearly approach it in the purposeless, meaningless, ambitionless primitive. The human being whose desires are practically nil, whose wishes are comparatively few, and who therefore lives in what we term an ideal state of not wanting. He not only does not want, he has never learned to want. Man in turn must gradually want, outgrow wanting, and learn not to want. But there's a great deal of difference between never knowing and outgrowing. So motion is really through polarization to ultimate equilibrium. And we are reminded, of course, of the famous line in the Zohar, the unbalanced forces must perish in the void. Everything that is unbalanced must cease, must ultimately be dissolved in balance. Almost every negative emotion or negative attitude that we have is an unbalance. Therefore, hate is an unbalance. Fear is an unbalance. Anything which causes the individual to depart from his own center and become hopelessly involved in circumferential problems results in unbalance. Remember in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Maat. If the scales balance, the soul may pass on into the blessed land. Therefore, balance, which is the great lesson of equilibrium, which in turn arises from man's experience of polarity. This procedure, through experience, brings man to one of the great discoveries, one of the great revelations, which sustain him and strengthen him for his spiritual adventure. Now, polarization affects us in many other ways. It gives us contrasts. Now, without contrasts, the lights and shadows of a picture, we call the picture very flat. Therefore, we believe in lights and shadows. But wherever we believe in them, we must endure them. And where we believe in lights and shadows, we must believe in pain and pleasure. We must believe in hope and despair. We must believe in gain and loss. And polarity tells us that we can never have a gain without a loss. And we can never have a loss without a gain. So over the inevitable, why should we grieve? Every individual who possesses must, to one way or another, be relieved of his possession. Any individual who gives up will in some strange way regain that which he has given away. The law of polarity is constantly operating in every department of our life. And the more extreme our attitudes become, the more vicious the swing of the pendulum. Thus the miser, who has become extreme in his cupidity, will experience often the greatest tragedy in the loss of his wealth. Always where the individual is unbalanced viciously or extensively or intensively, his problems are correspondingly modified. Great attachments mean great loss. Great attainments mean constant vigilance in the protection of a reputation so gained. Everything has its price, and this is another form of polarity. And the individual, therefore, attempting to escape from the vicious swings of this pendulum is led toward moderation of conduct, which was the great Socratic virtue. Socrates says, in all things not too much. And the golden mean, the concept that moderation releases the mind and the heart and the soul from unreasonable attachments and frees the mind, heart, and soul for the contemplation of realities. Thus, immoderation is not only a pernicious practice as far as the general life is concerned, but it dooms the individual to the perpetuation of ignorance. For that which exists in an immoderate state is in the poorest condition to learn. Moderation leads to contemplative freedom. The individual who is not the victim of his own intensities has therefore the tranquility for contemplation, for reflection, for meditation, for natural and detached observation of values. Plato declared that he was born into this world in the profession of an observer. And man gradually has to learn by becoming observant. To the degree that he is overly personal or overly attached, he is not observant and cannot be. Because when he is deformed in his judgment by the intemperances of his conduct, he is unable to estimate the values of things. Those things which he likes become increasingly unreally valuable. Those things which he does not like are not recognized for their full value. Therefore, like and dislike become polarities by which the truth is always obscured in these issues, because the young are not given the education which they usually most need. But this law of polarity, therefore, comes in so many places, breaking through the structure of society and giving us constant evidence that it is operating. Now, in the law of polarity, of course, we also have the laws which bring human beings together in various relationships: friendship, marriage, parent-children relationships. For nearly always these are subtly or factually polarizing. We know in psychology that all relationships have to a measure a polar foundation. We know also man's natural desire as a human being to unite with the polar opposite, not only for purposes of the perpetuation of the species, but also for association, comfort, inspiration, and understanding. All these factors indicate man's sense of incompleteness and emphasize the importance of polarity. Now, this again leads to one of the more profound philosophical observations on the subject, namely that polarity lies in the sphere of manifestation rather than in the sphere of substance. Things must physically or objectively appear polarized. But in their nature and substance, all things are in themselves in equilibrium. The spirit of man is forever in equilibrium. Therefore, the spirit of man must be and is an androgyne creature. It possesses within itself the capacity of polarization, but is not polarized except in manifestation. The particular and special polarization that we recognize being essentially physical. Thus, man, as a psychic or spiritual being, has an androgyne core, and in the effort to establish equilibrium in his objective life, he chooses marriage, he selects his mate, and attempts in this way to balance his own nature. both persons in the marriage being actually seeking to balance their own internal lives. Through association, the two individuals are partly restored to their natural androgen state. The man, through association with the woman, becoming more sensitive and having certain vital experiences which would not be possible to him alone in his polarized condition, and the woman vice versa. Therefore, in all instances, again, marriage is an effort to establish equilibrium, which in turn means harmonious organization or integration. And just as the moderation of the mind is necessary for creativity on a spiritual level, so the union or moderation of opposites on the physical level is necessary for the generation of the human being physically. So our law of polarity operates also on these levels. The law of polarity has its polarization in our psychic lives, in our mental and in our consciousness and conscience. On the psychic level, a polarization again is this struggle between internals and externals, in which the individual is either an extrovert or an introvert. The extrovert moving excessively outward, the introvert moving excessively inward. Moderation meaning both a rich internal and external life, a situation difficult to attain. On the mental level, the equivalent of the extrovert is the so-called concrete thinker, the person whose mind is directed toward achievement of some objective in the physical or visible universe. The abstract thinker is one whose mental life is turned to the invisibles, to the creativities, to the philosophies, religions, sciences, arts, where the greater amount of subjective intellect is employed. Either polarization without compromise or complement from the other can lead to excessive imbalance. And a large part of psychological imbalance is simply due to the individual moving too far in one direction and thereby violating the law of equilibrium. It is therefore important that every person with heavy physical responsibilities should have artistic, aesthetic, and cultural avocational releases. It is also important that the idealist and the dreamer and the mystic should have physical responsibilities by which he is assisted to maintain equilibrium and balance in his conduct. That is one of the reasons why it has always seemed very unwise, and from my experience it has been proven so, for individuals to attempt to depart from responsibilities in search of higher ideals. These higher ideals should be built upon responsibilities, upon the victorious and complete acceptance of duty, and not upon a running away from the need of man to serve the unknown need of God. These things must work together, must cooperate, and build toward a proper picture and a proper pattern. Now, out of these principles, out of this law of polarity leading to equilibrium, which is a great silence, comes another law, which is perhaps one of the most pleasant and the gentle laws that we have to contemplate in life. And that is the law which we call harmony and rhythm. Now, in nature, as Havelock Ellis realized, life is a kind of dance. Life is a magnificent motion. The Chinese Taoist, in his concept of Tao, or universal being, recognized truth, God, reality, the road, all of the mysterious principles which he gathered into the term Tao. He recognized these as the great Kun, or the eternal sound that goes on forever. And he also recognized this principle as the great rhythm, the great beauty that has neither beginning nor end. And out of harmony and rhythm has come man's concept of beauty. And law, perhaps, is never more perfectly revealed than by beauty. Now we can say, what is the law governing particularly the operation of harmony and rhythm? Well, I think probably we will agree that the most vital law associated with these things is mathematics. Therefore, the Pythagorean and Platonic schools admonished their disciples that no one who was ignorant of astronomy, mathematics, and music would enter the great schools of philosophy. Music, as an example of harmony and rhythm, is only one. We know, of course, Pythagoras is said to have been able to hear the music of the spheres, the sidereal or celestial music, the music that's played upon the great Veena of the god Shiva. Rhythm, perhaps, comes closest to us in the beat of the human heart. But everywhere in nature, there is harmony and rhythm, revealing itself through the processes of law. Harmony is a very large word. We think of it mostly in terms of sound, but harmony means much more. Harmony means order, means equilibrium in one sense, balance. It means the unfoldment of things with a perfection that is full of grace, full of exquisite beauty. And we discover law as beauty. One of the ways, traditionally, in which perhaps we make this discovery is in the pattern of the snowflake. Here we have immutable law revealing itself as exquisite beauty. We find it also in minute shell life and tiny living things like the radial area. We find it wherever nature is creating, in the distribution of leaves along the stem of a plant, in the petals of a flower. All these manifestations are beauty. We also observe it in the sunset, in the great vista of the plains, the mountains, and the sea. We also recognize that nature is never discordant, and the wildest abandon of color in a field of flowers will never include any jarring or unpleasant color notes. Everything blends, melds, and molds together into a highly acceptable symphony. Now, some intellectuals working on this problem have suggested that beauty is nothing more nor less than man's becoming accustomed to things. That the way things have always been must always be beautiful, whereas anything that deviates or breaks away is no longer beautiful. We have this, of course, in musical speculation and the introduction of dissonances, for which Richard Wagner, for one, was extremely famous. He attempted to prove that the dissonant intervals are also beautiful. For a time, he was bitterly attacked. Later, he was accepted, and it finally agreed that in spite of the unfamiliarity, there is actually in music no basic dissonance. Everything can be made beautiful if we know how. And if we use these intervals wisely and beautifully, they become beautiful. The law of harmony and rhythm also points out to us that life itself is a geometrical mystery, that the human soul is a geometrical marvel, that everything in life wants to be beautiful, presses forward to symmetry, and that law, wherever it has its perfect work, results in perfect beauty. The deformity, therefore, is in some way a limitation, a restriction, a falling short of nature's plan, and that even though perhaps nature must do a little experimenting in the effort, even experiments are beautiful in nature, which is more than we can say of futuristic art. But in any event, nature is forever moving in patterns that are strangely, grandly, and wonderfully acceptable to us. Standards of human beauty are forever changing, yet the quest for beauty is eternal. And the law of harmony and rhythm means that ultimately that which is harmonious and that which is rhythmic must fulfill the need of beauty. Harmony is a little different from rhythm in the sense that rhythm represents interval or tempo, whereas harmony represents blending, the union of things. In this it changes or differs again from melody. For the melodic line represents a tune that is recognizable, but harmony is the bringing together of things, of tones, of patterns, themselves different, perhaps set in different tonal patterns, but all coming together in one magnificent blending, as a magnificent symphony of Beethoven. Thus harmony is achieved through the soul power, for in harmony we must call upon the full orchestration of universals. In harmony we must be able to conduct the orchestra. Each instrument must play its part, and we must bind them together until they become one living instrument, like one great, vital, living pipe organ. In our living and thinking and breathing and hoping and fearing, therefore, the ancients advised that in all things we should seek harmony, and that in all things we should attempt to attain rhythm. The ancient Greeks were much given to a very literal interpretation of symbolism. And our old friend Socrates, who was not perhaps our idea of the figure of the Apollo, was addicted to the Terpsichorean muse and always danced with his disciples in the early morning. It might not have been an aesthetic sight for others, but it was of great aesthetic satisfaction to Socrates, which after all was the important point. And so, seeking to move with life, to dance the dance of life, we must also realize that it is not only work, that it is not only labor, struggle, effort, magnificent challenge, but it is also a matter of grace. And that things done graciously and beautifully have a peculiar virtue in themselves. And to be done beautifully and graciously, they must be done harmonically and rhythmically. The human being's psychological integration is nowhere more evident than in the reaction upon conduct in terms of grace and harmony. The neurotic, the introvert, the psychotic, is seldom able to control his body in a rhythm